In October 1789, approximately 7,000 women marched through the rain from the streets of Paris to the royal palace at Versailles. They were not carrying signs. Instead, they were armed with knives, muskets, and makeshift weapons taken from market stalls. They dragged cannons through the mud, and upon reaching the gilded gates of the palace, they had a single demand for King Louis XVI: give us bread. Within hours, they had forced the royal family into a carriage and marched them back to Paris at gunpoint. A king was humiliated and a monarchy was broken. All of it was triggered by the price of a loaf of bread. That was 1789. However, the story of bread and political violence began thousands of years before Marie Antoinette allegedly told the poor to eat cake. And it did not stop when the guillotine fell. If you had asked anyone living in the Jordan River Valley around 14,000 years ago what mattered most in life, they would not have said bread. They would not have even known the word. But the Natufian people, a group of semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers living in what is now modern-day Jordan, Israel, and Syria, were already doing something that would change the entire trajectory of human civilization. They were grinding wild grains between flat stones. Archaeologists working at a site called Shubaika in northeastern Jordan found charred bread fragments inside a stone fireplace in 2018. These crumbled remains were roughly 14,400 years old, making them the oldest evidence of bread ever discovered. What caught researchers off guard was that these bread fragments predated agriculture by at least 4,000 years. The Natufians were not farming wheat. They were gathering wild einkorn and barley from the hillsides, crushing the tiny seeds into a rough paste, mixing it with water, and baking flat discs of dough on heated stones near open fires. The bread would have been dense, gritty, and honestly not very appetizing by modern standards. Think of a cracker made from sand and good intentions, but it was calorie-dense, portable, and could be stored longer than raw grain. That mattered enormously for a group of people who spent most of their waking hours hunting gazelle and foraging for wild plants in the valleys near the Dead Sea. Having a food you could carry with you was a genuine advantage. Making the bread was hard work, though. Grinding grain between two stones called a saddle quern was brutally physical. Archaeologists examining Natufian skeletal remains have found severe wear on the knees, lower backs, and arm joints consistent with hours spent hunched over grinding stones. The labor of bread left marks on the human body before history had even begun to be recorded. Furthermore, the flour that came out of all that grinding was rough. It contained tiny fragments of stone that wore down teeth over years of eating. Dental studies of ancient remains from the Levant show extreme tooth erosion in populations that relied heavily on ground grain. Bread kept them alive, but it ground them down in the process. Despite all that effort, the Natufians kept making it. They kept crushing grain, mixing dough, building fires, and baking those flat, heavy cakes on hot stones. This raises an obvious question. Why go through all that trouble when you can just eat the grain raw, roast it, or boil it into porridge? The answer seems to be that bread was easier to carry, easier to share, and lasted longer than any alternative. It was the first food technology, and it worked well enough that people were willing to wreck their joints and their teeth to keep producing it. This is where the story takes a direction nobody expected. Some researchers now believe that bread did not emerge because humans had already domesticated wheat. It might have been the other way around. The desire to make more bread, to have a reliable supply of those flat cakes, may have been one of the reasons humans started farming in the first place. Bread did not come from agriculture. Agriculture may have come from bread. The transition from wild grain gathering to deliberate cultivation happened gradually across the Fertile Crescent over the next several thousand years. Villages formed near the wheat and barley fields. Permanent settlements grew around the grain stores. As the communities got larger, the grain surplus needed protection, organization, and eventually someone in charge. Bread was quietly building the foundations of civilization itself. By around 3000 BCE, the Egyptians had taken bread from a campfire survival food to something closer to an art form. Bakeries along the banks of the Nile were producing over 50 varieties of bread using different grains, flavors, and shapes. Some loaves were round, some were braided, and some were molded into the shapes of animals or figures for religious offerings placed inside tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Bread appeared in Egyptian hieroglyphics so often that the symbol for bread, a half circle sitting on a flat line, became one of the most common characters in their entire writing system. But the real breakthrough happened by accident. Nobody planned it. Somewhere along the Nile, probably in a kitchen attached to a brewery, someone left a batch of dough sitting out too long. Wild yeast, floating in the warm Egyptian air, landed on the wet flour mixture and started feeding on the sugars. The dough began to rise. When that puffy, fermented dough went into the oven, what came out was softer, lighter, and completely different from the flat, dense cakes humans had been eating for millennia. Leavened bread had arrived, and the Egyptians figured out how to replicate it by saving a piece of fermented dough, what bakers today call a starter, and mixing it into the next batch. The Greeks would later call the Egyptians artophagoi, which translates to bread eaters. It was meant as a mild insult, the ancient equivalent of calling someone basic, but the Egyptians could afford to shrug it off because they had turned bread into something far more useful than just food. They turned it into money. Workers building the Great Pyramids at Giza were paid in bread and beer. Archaeological records from the workers' village near the pyramid complex showed daily rations of 10 loaves of bread and a measure of beer for each laborer. Thousands of workers and thousands of loaves were baked every single day in massive bakeries discovered just south of the Sphinx. The entire pyramid construction project, one of the most ambitious building efforts in human history, ran on bread as its primary currency. If the bread stopped, the workers stopped, and the construction stopped with them. This was a warning sign. Bread was no longer just food. It was the thing holding the social contract together. Nobody understood that lesson better than Rome. By the 1st century BCE, the Roman Republic had grown into a sprawling empire of roughly 60 million people. The city of Rome itself was home to over 1 million residents packed inside its walls. Feeding them was a logistical nightmare. The farmlands surrounding Rome could not produce enough grain to sustain a city that size. So Rome became dependent on imported wheat, primarily from Egypt and the provinces of North Africa along the Mediterranean coast. Grain ships sailed from the port of Alexandria across the sea to Ostia, the harbor town at the mouth of the Tiber River, carrying thousands of tons of wheat in their hulls. From Ostia, the grain was loaded onto smaller barges and pulled upriver to the warehouses of Rome. The entire supply chain was enormous, fragile, and constantly under threat from storms, pirates, and political disruptions in the provinces. If the grain ships were delayed, the city panicked. If they were lost, people rioted. Roman politicians learned this the hard way and decided that the safest political strategy was simple: give the people free bread. The annona, Rome's grain dole, eventually provided free wheat and later free baked bread to roughly 200,000 Roman citizens. The poet Juvenal captured the arrangement perfectly when he wrote about bread and circuses. Keep the population fed and entertained, and they will not overthrow you. Cut the bread supply, and you are finished. The political logic was ruthless. Any aspiring Roman politician who wanted public support started by promising cheaper or more plentiful bread. The tribune Gaius Gracchus introduced subsidized grain sales in 123 BCE and gained enormous popularity for it. Decades later, Publius Clodius Pulcher pushed through a law making the grain dole entirely free, which won him a loyal following among Rome's poor. Bread became the most effective campaign tool in Roman politics. You did not win elections with speeches, you won them with wheat. The system also created a class of people who depended entirely on the state for their daily food. When the bread arrived on schedule, the city was calm. When supply disruptions hit, whether from a storm that sank the grain fleet or a provincial rebellion that interrupted shipments, the mood shifted fast. In 40 CE, Emperor Claudius was nearly mobbed in the Forum when a grain shortage left the city with only 15 days of reserves. The crowd pelted him with bread crusts. That is how thin the line was between order and chaos. This system worked mostly until it did not. When Emperor Aurelian expanded the bread dole in the 270s CE and started distributing baked loaves instead of raw grain, the administrative burden became staggering. State-run bakeries called pastrina operated across the city, and the bakers were essentially locked into their profession by law. A Roman baker could not quit, could not change careers, and could not leave the city. Their children inherited the obligation. Baking bread for Rome was not a job, it was a life sentence. The deeper problem was dependency. Rome had built its political stability on a food that it could not produce domestically. When the Vandals conquered North Africa in the 430s CE and cut off the grain supply from Carthage, it was a catastrophic blow. The Western Empire, already weakened by military pressure and internal dysfunction, lost access to the bread that kept its population calm. The warehouses at Ostia stood empty. The barges on the Tiber stopped moving. Bakeries that had operated continuously for generations shut their doors because there was simply no flour left to bake with. Within decades, the Western Roman Empire collapsed entirely. The grain ships stopped sailing, the bakeries went cold, and Rome, the city that had fed itself on Egyptian and North African wheat for centuries, shrank from 1 million people to fewer than 50,000. The greatest city in the ancient world became a shadow of itself, and the silence in those abandoned bakeries told a story better than any historian could. For a while after Rome fell, bread in Europe became simpler, rougher, and deeply tied to social class. The medieval period turned bread into a visible marker of who you were and where you stood in the feudal hierarchy. If you were a noble living in a stone manor house in 13th century England, you ate white bread called manchet, baked from finely sifted wheat flour. It was soft, pale, and expensive. If you were a peasant working the fields outside the manor walls, you ate dark bread made from maslin, a coarse mix of rye, barley, oats, and whatever else was available after the landlord took his share of the wheat harvest. The bread was dense, often gritty with bits of chaff and grit from the millstones, and sometimes stretched with ground acorns or beans when grain was scarce. The color of your bread announced your social class before you even opened your mouth. White bread meant wealth. Dark bread meant poverty. The system was enforced from the top down. The bread trade in medieval towns was tightly controlled by bakers' guilds that regulated who could bake and sell bread, where they could operate, and how they were trained. Becoming a master baker in medieval London required years of apprenticeship, and guild members jealously guarded their monopoly. But the regulation went both ways. Bakers were also closely watched for cheating because bread fraud was considered a serious crime against public welfare. Common tricks included adding sawdust, chalk, ground bones, or plaster to bulk up the flour, mixing bean meal into wheat dough to cut costs, or using alum to make dark bread appear whiter than it actually was. The fact that lawmakers kept passing rules against these practices tells you how often bakers tried them. In 1266, King Henry III of England enacted the Assize of Bread, one of the oldest consumer protection laws in the Western world. It regulated the price, weight, and quality of bread sold in English towns and tied the price of a loaf directly to the current cost of wheat. If grain prices rose, bakers could make smaller loaves. If prices fell, the loaves got bigger. Any baker caught cheating on weight or quality faced fines, public shaming in the pillory, or having their ovens destroyed. The assize survived in various forms for over 500 years, which tells you just how seriously medieval governments took the bread supply. Bread was not a market commodity you could play games with. It was the foundation of public order. Every ruler in medieval Europe understood the same truth the Romans had learned and the Egyptians had demonstrated before them. Control the bread and you control the people. Lose the bread and you lose everything. That lesson came roaring back during the most famous bread crisis in history, France 1789. By the late 1780s, France was in terrible shape. The country was buried in debt from years of expensive wars, including the support France had sent to the American Revolution. The royal court at Versailles was spending lavishly while the treasury ran dry. A series of poor harvests in 1787 and 1788 had driven grain prices through the roof. Then came the catastrophic hailstone of July 1788, which destroyed crops across northern France just weeks before the harvest. By the spring of 1789, the price of bread in Paris had climbed to roughly 80% of an average working family's income. Imagine spending 80% of your paycheck on bread alone. Not rent, not clothing, not heating, just bread. That was the reality for millions of French families, and the people baking and selling the bread were getting blamed for it, even though bakers were themselves being squeezed by the soaring cost of flour. Bakers in Paris during this period lived in genuine fear. Crowds accused them of hoarding grain, hiding flour, or deliberately keeping bread prices high to profit from the misery. Several bakers were attacked in their shops. In one case, a baker named Francois was dragged from his bakery by a mob and hanged from a lamppost after being accused of overcharging for bread. The accusation was likely false, but an angry, starving crowd does not wait for evidence. The famous phrase attributed to Marie Antoinette about letting the poor eat cake almost certainly was never said by her. The line appeared in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, written when Marie Antoinette was only 9 years old, and he attributed it to an unnamed princess. But it stuck to her because it captured a real anger. The queen lived in unimaginable luxury at Versailles, while ordinary families in Paris were starving because they could not afford a loaf. The rage built slowly and then exploded all at once. On October 5, 1789, market women in Paris started gathering in the central markets near Les Halles. The harvest had been poor again, bread was still scarce, and rumors were circulating that the king was hoarding grain at Versailles. The crowd swelled from dozens to hundreds to thousands. Estimates suggest roughly 7,000 women marched the 12 miles from Paris to Versailles through steady rain, armed with pikes, kitchen knives, muskets, and at least 2 cannons pulled from the city armory. When they arrived at the palace gates, they stormed the building. Several of the queen's personal guards were killed. The royal family was trapped inside. By the next morning, the king had agreed to sign the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and the crowd forced Louis, Marie Antoinette, and their children into a carriage and marched them back to Paris. The women walked alongside the carriage carrying loaves of bread on pikes, chanting that they were bringing the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's boy back to the city. The Women's March on Versailles was one of the defining moments of the French Revolution, and it was a bread riot at its core. The political philosophies of Rousseau, Voltaire, and Montesquieu gave the revolution its language, but bread gave it fuel. Hungry people do not wait for philosophers to tell them when to act. The revolution that followed was brutal, chaotic, and soaked in blood. The king was executed by guillotine in January 1793, and Marie Antoinette followed in October of that same year. The Reign of Terror claimed roughly 17,000 official executions and thousands more deaths in prisons and provincial purges. And through all of it, bread remained the central political obsession. The revolutionary government imposed price controls on bread called the maximum, and bakers who charged more than the set price could be arrested or worse. Even Napoleon understood when he seized power in 1799. One of his first priorities was stabilizing the bread supply. He reportedly said that a man will fight harder for his interests than for his rights, and for the average French citizen, bread was the interest that mattered most. The 19th century brought a different kind of revolution to bread, not political but industrial. For thousands of years, grain had been ground between heavy stones in local mills, powered by water wheels or wind. The process was slow, and stone grinding produced whole grain flour with the bran and germ still mixed in, which gave the bread flavor and nutrition, but also made it spoil faster and appear darker. In the 1870s, a new technology arrived from Hungary and Switzerland. Steel roller mills could crush wheat kernels more efficiently than stones, and more importantly, could separate the white starchy endosperm from the darker bran and germ with precision that stone mills never achieved. Suddenly, pure white flour became affordable to produce in large quantities, and white bread, the kind that had been reserved for aristocrats and wealthy merchants for centuries, became available to ordinary people for the first time. The mills transformed the economics of bread almost overnight. Large industrial mills replaced thousands of small village operations. Railroad networks carried flour from centralized mills to cities across Europe and North America. Bakeries scaled up, prices dropped, and white bread became the default, the standard, the thing everyone expected when they walked into a shop. But there was a cost. Stripping away the bran and germ removed most of the fiber, vitamins, and minerals that had made bread a nutritionally complete food for thousands of years. White bread looked better, lasted longer on the shelf, and felt softer in your mouth, but it was nutritionally hollow compared to what humans had been eating since the Natufians first crushed wild grain on stone slabs near the Jordan River. By the early 20th century, the consequences started showing up. Populations that had shifted heavily to white bread began developing higher rates of beriberi and pellagra, diseases caused by vitamin deficiencies that had been rare when people ate whole grain bread. Governments responded by mandating that white flour be enriched with the vitamins that milling had stripped out, essentially adding back artificially what the industrial process had removed. It was an odd solution when you think about it. Spend enormous effort removing the nutritious parts of the grain, then spend more effort putting synthetic versions of those same nutrients back in. The 20th century pushed bread even further from its ancient origins. In 1961, researchers at the British Baking Industries Research Association in Chorleywood, England, developed a new method for making bread that would change the industry forever. The Chorleywood bread process used intense mechanical mixing, chemical additives, and extra yeast to produce a loaf of bread in under 3 and 1/2 hours from start to finish. Traditional bread making with long fermentation could take 12 to 18 hours. Chorley would cut that down to a fraction of the time and produce softer, cheaper loaves that could be manufactured on an industrial scale. Today, roughly 80% of the bread sold in the United Kingdom is made using the Chorleywood process or a close variation of it. The method spread to dozens of countries and became the backbone of commercial bread production worldwide. Your average grocery store loaf, the one in the plastic bag with the soft crust and the week-long shelf life, is almost certainly a descendant of that Chorleywood laboratory. Critics have argued that Chorleywood bread is barely bread at all. The ingredient lists on commercial loaves include emulsifiers, preservatives, enzymes, added gluten, and processing aids that would have been unrecognizable to a baker working even 100 years ago. The long fermentation that traditional bread depended on, the slow process that developed complex flavors and made the bread easier to digest, was eliminated in favor of speed and cost savings. What replaced it was efficiency. The bread was cheaper, softer, lasted longer, and could be produced in enormous volumes. Whether it was actually better is a different question entirely. The bread itself had changed completely, but its political power had not faded at all. In January 2011, protests erupted across Egypt. Demonstrators filled Tahrir Square in central Cairo by the tens of thousands, calling for the resignation of President Hosni Mubarak, who had held power for nearly 30 years. The causes were complex, including corruption, unemployment, police brutality, and demands for democratic reform. But underneath all of those grievances was a familiar pressure. Food prices, and specifically bread prices, had been climbing for months. Egypt is the largest per capita consumer of bread in the world. The average Egyptian eats roughly 330 libis of bread per year, more than almost any other nation. The Egyptian government had maintained bread subsidies for decades, selling a flatbread called aish baladi at heavily subsidized prices through government bakeries. The word aish is the Egyptian Arabic word for bread, and it also means life. That is not a coincidence. The subsidy system was massive. By 2011, Egypt was spending billions of dollars annually to keep bread affordable, importing roughly half its wheat from international markets. Government bakeries across Cairo, Alexandria, and smaller cities produced millions of loaves daily at prices far below market rates. Lines outside these bakeries stretched around the block every morning, and fights regularly broke out over places in the queue. People died in bread lines, not from violence but from the heat, the crush of bodies, and the sheer physical toll of waiting hours for a bag of flatbread in the Egyptian sun. When bread prices rise in Egypt, governments fall. It happened in 1977 when President Anwar Sadat tried to cut bread subsidies and triggered riots so severe that he reversed the decision within 48 hours. The pressure was back in 2010 and 2011 as global wheat prices spiked due to droughts in Russia and Australia. The Egyptian Revolution of 2011 was not solely about bread. Reducing it to that would be dishonest. But bread was the pressure beneath the surface, the chronic stress that made every other grievance feel unbearable. When you cannot feed your family, abstract demands for democratic reform become very concrete very quickly. Egypt was not alone. The same wave of uprisings that swept North Africa and the Middle East during the Arab Spring had bread shortages and food inflation woven into nearly every one of them. In Tunisia, where the Arab Spring began when a street vendor named Mohamed Bouazizi set himself on fire in December 2010, rising food prices had been a source of public anger for months. In Syria, a devastating drought from 2006 to 2010 destroyed wheat crops in the northeastern provinces and displaced roughly 2 million people into already overcrowded cities, adding fuel to the tensions that eventually erupted into civil war in 2011. The pattern kept repeating. Sudan experienced bread riots in 2018 when the government removed wheat subsidies and bread prices tripled overnight. Protesters filled the streets of Khartoum and other cities, and the unrest eventually contributed to the overthrow of President Omar al-Bashir in April 2019 after 30 years in power. Once again, bread was the trigger that turned simmering frustration into open revolt. 14,000 years ago, the Natufian people crushed wild grain between two stones and baked the paste on a hot rock near the banks of the Jordan River. They could not have imagined what that simple act would set in motion. Their flatbreads led to farming, farming led to villages, villages led to cities, and cities led to empires. Empires, time and again, rose and fell on whether they could keep bread affordable and available to the people living inside their borders. Egypt paid its pyramid workers in loaves. Rome gave free bread to 200,000 citizens to prevent rebellion. Medieval England regulated bread prices with laws that lasted 5 centuries. France exploded into revolution when bread consumed most of a family's wages. In the 21st century, governments across the Middle East and North Africa collapsed when bread became too expensive for ordinary people to buy. No other food has this track record. Rice comes close in parts of Asia, but bread holds a unique place in the political history of Western civilization and increasingly in global politics as wheat markets connect every continent through a single supply chain. A drought in Russia can raise bread prices in Cairo within weeks. A war in Ukraine can empty bakery shelves in Khartoum. The world is more connected now than it has ever been, and bread sits at the center of that web. The grain has changed, the ovens have changed, and the supply chains stretch across oceans now instead of running between a village mill and a village baker. But the fundamental equation has never changed. When people can afford bread, societies hold together. When they cannot, societies come apart. Every government that has ever existed has understood this, and the ones that forgot paid the price. Bread is the oldest social contract. It was the first food we built civilization around, and it remains the one food that can tear civilization down. That has been true for 14,000 years, and there is no reason to believe it will stop being true anytime soon. If this story changed the way you look at the simple loaf on your table, please subscribe and like the video so more people can discover this history. We are excavating the deep roots of the world they tried to simplify. Let's nourish the future by understanding the past. The next hidden treasure of history will be uncovered soon.